Okay. Um, okay, so we have two main things tonight. The research, uh, working on Eric's term analysis research and talking about kind of more specification on our one of our 2019 goals. Um, but first, want to do kind of the other main parts of the meeting. Um, so start with changes. Do any of you all have other changes to add? Nope. Okay. So I was doing some like poking around, looking at priorities, the algorithm priority column, and so actually hit up like a bunch of like I think like 75% of the domains that we cover. So apologies if I'm stepping on toes. I was just like spot checking, but found a couple of really interesting ones that I thought would be useful to bring up here. And the first is, let's see, I'll pull it up. The first is this water enforcement change. And I can share my screen. So on the water enforcement page, there's some pretty significant, or what I thought were pretty significant changes, mostly around like this section here was interesting to me. It's like taking away all of this information about like enforcement data, how to find enforcement data, all that kind of good stuff. And then also there are all these took away the section about municipal wastewater and stormwater management. It took away a lot of like sections about. Let's see, where is one? Sorry, 1 a.m. It took away different like the link to the compliance assistance program. Removes information about Deepwater Horizon, just removes this particular sentence about EPA investigating the underground injection wells, and in a link to learn more about energy extraction and how that impacts wastewater. So anyway, just another Safe Drinking Water Act compliance assistance program link removed. Anyway, so I've had a lot of interesting removals and not all that many additions. I wonder where I can move that. And I thought it was interesting in that, the interviewing team just had this big report on enforcement showing enforcement numbers are like drastically down. And then, there are all this like, and they're like, oh, we're focusing more on compliance rather than enforcement, but taking away all these links to compliance assistance programs, and like just generally removing information. So I thought this was an interesting one.
Yeah, one of the things I'm wondering about, because it's sort of a pattern that I've seen, there are quite a few places on the left where the default is just learn about something, and then there's the link to it. And then on the left, more extensive narrative that might have been there describing that same program is eliminated, but they still have a link, they may have a link to that activity or that another page. I haven't had, obviously can't see that here, but that's a pattern I sometimes have seen on some pages where an explication of the work is gone and they just reduce it down to a link to that program. And obviously, it's reduced access, and to what extent the link itself includes that information is a question as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what's going on here, but yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it just happened, right? Looks like it. I mean, in
Mm-hmm.
October, between this one day, October 31st.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't looked at many of the like the change in outgoing links, or like compared. One thing is interesting. They're clicking on the national enforcement initiatives. Um, it's been renamed the National Compliance Initiative, which they did have a press release about and stuff. But uh, I haven't actually I haven't looked at this page to see how different the National Compliance Initiative page was from its previous National Enforcement Initiative for that given topic.
Yeah, I've seen that change reflected in some sidebars for a while.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, does your, I guess let's see, EPA.gov/enforcement, so being the, Marcy, is that one of your, no. I think it's Sarah's old one. So, yeah, I want to go compare, I want to, for all of these, they're like, they have the topical, it's like National Compliance Initiative, and then, it's given topic, um, to compare if these pages are different from their prior versions under the National Enforcement Initiative.
The URL on that page you just showed was from the enforcement. It was starting with enforcement as well, not water. Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Eric, were you going to mention something?
Yeah. I remember when you posted this, I went through it very quickly. And one of the things that stood out was, they removed a lot of links, but then they also added some back in, a lot back in. The links that stood out to me to be completely removed were the ones to Echo,
Mm-hmm.
which is the Enforcement and Compliance History Online, essentially data platform that allows people to access the data the EPA has on enforcement and compliance. There's 0 links to that now, where before there were several.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because that was, this is all in the context of the report the interview team released last week. In response to that report, EPA said, well, this data is based on our ecosystem, and well, that's flawed, which is obnoxious, right? Because it's the best available data we have, and it's EPA's own data. And so now it seems there's some islanding of it going on.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. That'd be interesting to follow up on the, with the link analysis, to see. It may or may not be interesting since so many places would like be linking to specific pages within Echo, but I reached out to the interviewing team about this, and then Leif said he'd be interested in talking. So maybe a report in a blog post or something might be. And then I haven't seen. I did a kind of non-systematic look into the some past changes in the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, and haven't really seen. Haven't seen anything else that looks like all that interesting to have kind of like a larger compilation report, but that definitely warrants a closer look. So I'll look into that. And the next one, that I think is interesting is this one on EPA collaboration with Japan. And, um, and with this one, I think I know like with that, Liz has found some international, some interesting changes on international cooperation pages of late, and we've already had a couple of reports on them. So maybe a broader synthesis and tying this in, or maybe another report. But the page with about this cooperation with Japan has changed in some ways, like less significantly than the last change on water enforcement, but really has a tone change from like we are collaboratively like partnership building and learning together and learning from each other to more like the U.S. is sharing expertise on XYZ topic, so there's that, and then that just highlights that are likely to change. But a couple of other things that are interesting are it removes this whole section on combating climate change by limiting pollutants. It also removes the e-waste, cleaning up electronic waste. So a couple of kind of hot topics that it removes information about, and also kind of just downplays the nuclear radiation issue, where it was kind of front and center before, after the 2011 Fukushima disaster. Now it's kind of it's included in one of these sections, but it's not like right at the front of the page anymore. Any ideas on next steps for this one?
I mean, I like the idea of some sort of synthesis, even if it is at least somewhat rehashing old ground. But something that puts all of it into the same context and frame. Like, here's what we've seen in terms of international cooperation across EPA or across all federal agencies.
I've got, the international under DOE, so I can take a look and see if there's something parallel going on. They're often on totally different wavelengths from each other, but it's probably worth checking it out.
That's a great idea. Okay, yeah. I like that idea. It could be one of our first stepping back and synthesizing exercises. Okay, so that's it for changes. Sorry that.
I just wanted to say, like, on that note, more from the first one that we were talking about with the wastewater, really with the echo links. I mean, we don't have anything well set up to do this, but we have things halfway set up to do this. So we could totally say, like, if we had 2 time frames we wanted to look at, and we could look at every snapshot in our database from like the earliest and the end, like the start and the end of that time frame, and see how many links there are to echo stuff in each of those time frames, and see how they've changed on a per page or on a like across everything we have basis. This is definitely something we could do. I mean, it wouldn't be straightforward, but like we have half the stuff in place to do it, so it's not like we have to create some whole crazy thing for it.
I think that'd be huge. Eric, you've done some.
Yeah. So I did this looking at 2016, 2018. So I did it outside of Scanner because we don't have 2016 snapshots in Scanner, but it would be totally, yeah, I mean, it's totally doable, and I don't think it would be much work I mean, Rob, you've already shared some code for accessing pages and versions with me that I've used before, and so just putting together the stuff that looks at links with that, it wouldn't be that hard. And it's something that I wanted to do anyway with the National Climate Assessment, looking at what's linking to that, so that could be two birds, one stone.
Yeah. Let me know, like, if you need help with it, or if you want to, like, figure out a time when we can sit down and, like, work together on it or whatever.
Yeah, let me just pull together some thoughts and some code, and maybe it'll come together really easily, and if it does, great. If not, I'll reach out.
Cool.
Great. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, next part of the agenda, update from report writing team. Marcy, you want to give a quick update?
We have been sort of in this back and forth mode with Elizabeth Sjogren from the Center for Investigative Reporting about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Keeps getting dragged out, but the latest was that, and she started, it took us a long time for her to actually say yes, she wanted an exclusive. But once that happened, things seemed to sort of slow down also. And then she indicated just last week, well, before that, she indicated that she was trying to link it up with another story to give it, these two threads were going to be something big. And then last week, I think right before Thanksgiving, right, she told us that she'd just gotten back information from a FOIA that is really said it's really, really important stuff that's she hopes to bring into the story at this point. So that's what we know. And, she's relatively diligent about getting back to us, like maybe once a week on status. So we'll see where that's headed. But interesting sort of mystery there about what it is that she's finding.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be published soon. And the Sagebrush report is in content review, and maybe up next is a water enforcement report.
Gretchen, I'm not sure whether Gretchen and Justin Shell want to get together on this, or whether at this point just loop back with Gretchen. But I think at a point in the content review, gosh, a lot of work there, guys. Where I think it'd be good to touch base, just because I'm finding some things that I had some questions about. And the comments are there on the report. So whenever it works for you, I mean, I can keep working on it, but I think it is a pretty good time to talk about some things.
Awesome.
Okay, so just let me know.
Okay. Yeah, and Justin, let me know if your interest or availability.
Yeah, just set up a time. I can hopefully do it.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Awesome. Dev team.
Oh, let's see. So, I guess, so maybe I posted a whole bunch of things in Slack over the course of last week and this week. Since as we're getting closer to trying to focus more on, like, moving off of Versionista, there's a lot of stuff I've been looking at to make sure things are working well. And so one of the things that came out of the woodwork there was noticing that there's a lot of sorts of content and URLs that we're tracking that I'm not sure if we really want to be. And so I wrote a little bit, I think, in Slack about how there's a lot of like things that are just images that probably, I assume, we don't really want to track. There's a lot of things that are files like PDFs that I'm not sure whether we want to track or not. And then things like Word docs and PowerPoint files and things that I'm more certain that we probably don't want to track. And then also like oddball pages like that interstitial, like you're linking out to another website page, which really doesn't belong there. And I'm all but certain there are more of those, and most of them are reasonably easy to identify based on how their URL is set up. So I can probably go find how many there are that look that way. But bottom line, like out of 30 or 40,000 pages that we're tracking, a good few thousand seem to be things that maybe we don't want to. So one of the things we did in the dev team meeting this morning was decide that we're going to add some stuff to the database so that we can flag things that we don't want to actively track without having to throw that information away. So now that sort of says we need to hear back from you about what we should turn that flag off for, and basically say like don't worry about continuing to track this stuff. Don't try and import new versions from Wayback or from Versionista or from anywhere else, because really we don't want to like look at updates to these images every time or whatever.
Right.
So that's one thing. Another.
Can we talk about that for a minute?
Yeah.
While we're on that topic. One of the things that just gave me pause when you listed them as PDFs. I mean, there have been some significant changes that are a function of a link to a PDF missing, or the PDF, some PDFs gone that are important fact sheets or whatever. So I mean, you probably should look at it. I can go back, and look at my own stuff a little more, but I'd be a little worried about cutting those off.
Yeah, I think I felt like that might have been the case, which is why I was sort of saying I didn't feel very certain that we would necessarily want to stop tracking PDFs. But again, like we will shortly be able to flip that flag for whatever you want. And we can do that in a systemic way, like go through and find all the PDFs and turn it off for them. Or we can say, these 5 PDFs, turn it off, or turn it off for all, but turn it on for these 5, whatever we want to do. But yeah, I mean, it did seem to me like there were PDF documents we cared about in a way that probably there weren't very many like Word documents or Excel files that we care about.
Mm-hmm. I think that's probably true. Yeah.
And as this is a backup or whatever, we could try to bulk add all of those PDFs to the Wayback Machine, and if necessary. So if we're concerned about the PDFs themselves versus like links to the PDFs, we don't need to, have the PDFs themselves be harvested every time if we know that they're someplace safe. And all we're concerned about is the links to them.
Yeah, I should also try and be clear here that as long as we're pulling in data from external sources like Versionista or Wayback or whatever, this setting only needs to affect what winds up like in our database, and therefore what winds up in your sheets and what we can diff in Scanner. It doesn't necessarily need to affect what we're telling Wayback folks. Hey, can you please make sure that you're always regularly archiving this URL? So there's a difference between like what Wayback might be doing and what data we're pulling out of Wayback. And this flag only has to be about that second thing, what we pull out. Although we could also use it to influence the list of things that we give them and say, can you please track this stuff or not? So there's also like multiple levels of like maybe, well, that's another question, right? Like, does this need to be more granular? Do we need to have a way to say, like, we're not actively monitoring it, but we are making sure that it gets actively archived? So are there like two levels of this that we need to have instead of just an on-off? Open questions.
So what's the dev group's time frame in terms of getting these things resolved?
So I wrote all the code to enable that capability this afternoon. So it's sort of waiting on somebody else having time to take a look at it and say, seems sane, you didn't do anything ridiculous. And then we will have that capability. And then it's just about knowing what things we want to turn that on and off for. For now, because I don't expect that it's something we want to change all the time, we're not building any user interface to it. So for now, it's just going to be like, tell me or Jason or Dan or somebody, and we'll flip the bit in the app. In the future, we probably want to get to a place where you can do that instead of us. We're trying to balance the amount of work to do that versus like what's actually worthwhile and all the different things that we're trying to do. So for now, no user interface, unless you tell me that like we really need to be able to like modify this all the time.
Okay, thanks. I interrupted you moving on to another topic.
Oh, so let's see. I think the next thing was probably the National Climate Assessment. So after Eric pointed out that launched on Friday, I spent some time on Sunday playing with various ways to scrape and crawl it, partially because we're experimenting around with our own scraping and crawling stuff called Walk, which I don't remember if we've talked about here or not. It's sort of a joint experimental, like it's kind of back burner. We're not putting a huge amount of effort into it. Piece of work between us and archiving, as to like what would we need to have our sort of ideal scraping and monitoring of web pages, rather than depending on other third parties that are good or bad in various different ways. And so that National Climate Assessment site is reasonably small, and it seemed like a good place to experiment. And one of the useful outputs from that is that left me with a list of every URL for every piece of that website, and a list of every URL for a part of that website you would browse to, right? So like everything that's a page or like a PDF that you would browse to or download. So the difference between like things that are pages and all the things that like are parts of the page, like the images and the styles and the scripts and everything. So we have both of those. So we have ways of saying like, oh, here's all the parts of that entire website, or ways of saying here are the pages that we would actually monitor or track. And so I can take that list and add all of those pages or a subset of those pages to Scanner. I have also taken that list and made sure that every other day we poke the Internet Archive to archive it. And that works differently than most of the stuff we're doing right now, because most of the stuff we have been doing relies on like us giving a list of URLs to somebody over at the Internet Archive, and they shove it on some like machine they have in a corner that goes off and does special scrapes for people all the time. And it just goes through our list of all the URLs we're tracking. And due to the fact that that's a complicated process of like changing it, is some of you telling me or somebody else on the dev team, and then me going and finding somebody at the Internet Archive to like update the machine. Then occasionally the machine falls over. So like we actually maintain a health check to monitor that stuff is getting actively archived, because occasionally it falls over and they don't necessarily notice. So my experimental alternative that I'm also experimenting with, now that I scraped all those URLs from the National Climate Assessment, is us maintaining our own machine that just on a regular schedule, right now it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday morning, uses Internet Archive's Save Page Now functionality to make sure all those URLs get saved. And we do it in kind of a funky way to make sure that they get fully saved with all the like sub resources and parts that are inside them. But yeah. So that is the thing that's going on there. We're experimenting, I guess, with whether that's a better approach or not in general. But that also means that we are from day 3 actively monitoring and archiving all of National Climate Assessment. And I can add whatever pages we want to add to Scanner. It sounded like we sort of said on chat, add all the web pages, but not the PDFs and not the PowerPoints. So I can do that. And I think those are the big dev updates. Oh, one other thing, an important point to know, a thing I found out last week while I was working through all the various issues with importing data more reliably from way back, is that even though they have reasonably long since decided that they don't obey robots.txt anymore, so any URL on a government website should be accessible through the Internet Archive. That's not universally true. Some parts of their infrastructure still obey robots.txt, and that's the thing they're working on. I have no idea what the time frame is on changing it. And some of those parts of the infrastructure are things we depend on in order to be able to ask what URLs have been snapshotted in what time frame, which is kind of a critical piece of importing data from them. So that turns out to mean that some of the URLs we track are ones that are blocked by robots.txt, and that means we will cease to be able to track them when we stop using Versionista. Or at least we'll cease to be able to track them as long as our primary source of data is Wayback. Right now, I don't have a full list of all of those, but I should work on putting that together. That's on me to do, so that you know what they are. I don't think it's a big list, for what it's worth. I think that's it.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, at the dev meeting today, it was like Rob had done like this long of a list of things. Lots of work. Okay, real quick, and I'll put this on Slack. Actually, I'll just put this on Slack, this exercise that I want everyone to do with their monitoring this week. Just to I eventually want to move towards like really using that priority column to increase our efficiency and hopefully like have increased the likelihood of finding important changes quickly.
So can you tell us what the exercise is?
Oh, sorry. Just for now, so I've done a review through a fair amount, like maybe about half of like the first half of the domains of the first half of November, looking through the priority values and kind of seeing like what looks like, what are interesting changes, what's the priority value associated with them for each domain, how many changes total are there, and how many of those changes don't have a priority value assigned to them. And so basically just seeing like how reliably could we say analysts only look at like, priority values above 0.25 or, some threshold that we choose. So, it would shrink the list of changes to look at considerably. And so I've done like a fair amount of looking into this, but there also have been like improvements in. I think that these weeks we'll see a lot fewer pages or changes that don't have a priority assigned to them, uh, based on some of that long list of work that Rob's been doing. Um, so just I want to get more data about whether or not that's an approach that we really could take. Because if so, that would be really like primo. So anyways, just like having people kind of keep good track, even if it's a change that doesn't quite make it into the like, I think this is an important change. Just kind of like getting a feel for what the different priority values mean in terms of a change on the page. Okay, and onto Eric's exercise. I think for the discussion of the 2019 goals, I think I'm going to try really hard to get that discussion going in Slack. So, because I think it'd be good to do this this research in the remaining time of this meeting.
Yeah, so really what I wanted to do was to start, see if we could take a crack at some of the term count outputs that we have from looking at counting 60,000 terms across ultimately about 5,000 pages between 2016 and 2018. That 5,000 pages number comes from just the ones that had workable, usable data in both timeframes. And so I'm going to share a link to the research team folder in Slack, or sorry, in
Chat.
Zoom. And so hopefully that'll work. That should get you, it should be shared. This folder should be shared to specifically 2 files in here. So first is called stats. Well, the first, actually, there's 3 files to take a look at. So this first is a document. So open that doc, scroll down to the interesting stuff. It's the second page. And really, I'm thinking here we can start just to bullet point some of the interesting things, patterns we're noticing in this, results. Okay, so there's a lot here, and I want to try to get a sense of what we feel is the most important things to pick up on. So I've started bullet pointing out some of the things that I've noticed. I've done a pretty bad job of actually digging into each and trying to figure out what explains each change. So I plan on working on that. But really, I think what we can do tonight is simply just kind of lay out some of the interesting trends we see. And so the way we do that is to go back to the folder where there's 2 more files. The first is called stats by term. And so that's really just for every term we looked at, first a kind of overall view of how those terms changed across every page, and then, term by term, how does that break down by agency and then individual page. So if you're interested in a particular term, climate change, jobs, adaptation, you would start in this spreadsheet. If you're more interested in particular agencies and how their use of different kinds of terms have changed, start in the agency, stats by agency file. And so this breaks it down by the different agencies we've identified. So if you want to really know about EPA, go to the EPA and see, okay, how is the terms changed kind of at the agency-wide level. Really, again, it is just about starting to bullet point out some of what's actually interesting, important to look at here. depending on where you're coming from, more from the term side, more from the agency side. There's two different cuts of the data. So I task you all in this exercise with picking a term, picking an agency, seeing what's interesting, and writing a finding or two down in this interesting stuff, bullet point. So we've got about 6 minutes or so until our hour's up. So I figured, looks like people have been writing down some things. So maybe we can reconvene, say a little bit about what we found, and also scope. Does it seem like there's a lot more here, too much here? Or whether you feel like you got the really the most important things, and maybe, as I was doing this, I was starting to think about, okay, how can we start to categorize these and maybe lump them together, so it's not just one bullet list of this happened and this happened. So for instance, we could group these together in terms of type of agency. I think Gretchen has recommended that before, regulatory versus non-regulatory agencies and how they change different terms. We could group them in terms of the terms themselves. Some of these terms that we're noticing are, climate change oriented and climate impacts oriented, like wildfires, storms, droughts. Some of them are more to do with procedures and agency actions themselves, like efficiency, compliance. So that might be one way to organize our gathering. But yeah, I'm curious what people found.
I do think it'd be interesting to have have an issue or a concept or whatever, and then look at how different agencies discuss it. And I do like the idea of like regulatory versus non-regulatory, or even like if there are more more distinctions than that, like organizations with a mission to protect the environment, to like respond to disaster, to like be a scientific engine behind federal actions, and so in that way, like grouping terms, not necessarily going through and having a term by term comparison, but how does things like weather and as compared to climate and all that. I also think that looking at kind of groups of things, like I was just looking at EPA and seeing, clean, just interestingly, so clean energy decreased by half, but also discussion of fossil fuels, which I guess is more of a politicized term. Like nobody that is pro fossil fuels calls it fossil fuels. But, kind of looking at how all of those, I guess it's similar, this issue of like energy production, and how those different terms are leveraged.
I think maybe also looking at, so I was just looking at enforcement and compliance, since we were just talking about that earlier. And one of the things that I was just noticing that's interesting is you could look at the numbers really broadly and say like, yep, it's clear, like they're sort of like one term's going down, the other term's going up. But it's interesting looking at the breakdown by agency, because where one is changing significantly is not necessarily the same places where the other is changing significantly. So I think it's like FEMA has like compliance now has like gone through the roof in terms of its percentage change, like a lot more, but it hasn't really changed its use of enforcement at all. And like that's maybe an interesting story to dig deeper into. Is it just that like FEMA didn't look at that sort of thing at all before, and so it's the new language is the language, or what exactly? I think OSHA was another one where there was a similar sort of like skew in what was happening with one term versus the other, where it wasn't just like one's going like they're just indirect relationship, they're like a different relationship.
I was looking at pollution because in part that's where EPA sort of still is saying it has responsibilities depending on how you define pollution. They'll harken back to Rachel. They'll be willing to harken back to Rachel Carson and address that. But I found these sites where there was this huge drop-off in pollution and others where there was an increase. And the drop-offs were, guess what, related to the Clean Power Plan. But data.gov had increases. Science Matters, which is sort of their newsletter they send out, which is actually a pretty interesting rag, had substantial increases, as did NIEHS. So, interesting questions to explore there as well from a term standpoint.
Yeah, and to your point about pollution and the Clean Power Plan, I think that's ultimately one way to scope this, is to think about, we've talked about this in the research team setting, but, we have all these numbers and we should report them, but we should also contextualize them in the cases, specific pages that we've already documented changing, to give a bit more of a narrative. Like, this is, okay, here are all the numbers, but here are some of the important reasons explaining these numbers and the important sort of cases behind that. And obviously the removal of the Clean Power Plan pages is a key part of the story with pollution, it seems. Obviously with climate change, a key part of that decrease is, the EPA's climate change pages being redirected. I think that's going to be one way to think about what to focus on as well.
There's so much there, Eric. Thank you. Really, it's amazing.
Obviously, don't need to look at it all, but I think we have some good ideas for starting to organize a way forward. So that is good.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I like thinking of this. Great. Do you want to post this to the channel so people could, like, at their leisure, poke around and see interesting things?
That's a great idea. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, and I will. I'm gonna post on the channel, try to get a discussion going about the 2019 goal specification. It kind of ties in with this in that it's really like, we've said we want to, like, document and contextualize and synthesize, but we need boundaries around that, and focus areas. And so my goal over the next couple of weeks is to really identify, like, what are our driving research questions and the kinds of outputs we want to or outcomes that we want to have, outputs that will get us there. And so what kind of data do we need in order to do those? And so it's kind of asking, like, are there domains that we want to, like, not worry about anymore, but just still have them, like, in the database, but just not, like, worry about them anymore? Are there
or for now?
Or for now, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah. And, are there like focus areas that we really want to dive deep on and we like learn more of that, the subject matter expertise around it as well. Anyway, so that's the goal of that. And I'll try to get that discussion going in Slack more, so that by the end of this year, we'll really have a plan for next year.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. It's good to see you.
Yes, thank you. I like your haircut.
Oh, thank you.
And I don't know how we want to coordinate getting together around sage grouse, but your schedule's the one that's sort of we need to work around. So
I'm flexible. I'll send you and Justin a Slack message.
Okay. And I'll keep plugging away at it.
Awesome. Thank you.
But we can meet anytime. I think it would be helpful for me to get you guys' perspective on a few things.
Okay.
Great.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks all.
Thanks everybody. Take good care.
Bye.